of NMC online symposia that have covered topics of all sorts. This particular event is focused on exploring new media and its intersections with learning, obviously. But in particular, we're very interested in how that can be expressed a number of ways. And yesterday, we devoted the day to digital storytelling, and today we're going to kick it off in a different direction. And our keynote speaker, Constance Steinkuhler, is going to talk to us about gaming. I'll tell you a little bit more of that in a second. And the rest of the day is going to take us off into some other directions as well, so that we'll be looking at augmented reality. We'll be looking at applications of new media in museums. You're going to look at how Penn State has built an educational gaming initiative in their institution, something Constance would know about because they have something very similar, the GLS at Wisconsin, and ending the day with a unique application of how one history professor is using Twitter to bring history alive in his classes. So we have a really interesting day ahead of us. I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Constance with us today. Constance is an educational researcher studying massively multiplayer online games from a learning sciences and new literacy studies perspective. She's especially interested in what young adults learn from their online play, and she's an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she teaches courses in virtual worlds, research methods, and the smart side of pop culture. She works with a team of graduate students and high school and undergrad volunteers as well, investigating forms of culture and cognition that arise in online games such as RuneScape, World of Warcraft, and Lineage. Her dissertation actually focused on Lineage as well. And her current studies focus on informal science, digital and print literacy, computational literacy, collective problem solving, distributed apprenticeship, and pop cosmopolitanism. She's also part of the UW-Madison initiative called Games, Learning, and Society, the GLS group, that studies how young people engage in meaningful ways with new forms of interactive digital media. Please join me in welcoming our very special guest, Constance Steinkuhler. Take it away, Constance.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I see some familiar names, so greetings to all of you that I've met before in the past. And thanks for having me. I should probably thank the staff because, wow, did they make my avatar. You know, I asked them to make me 10 years younger, 10 IQ points smarter, and much more charming, and I think they did a great job of it, so thank you. I'm going to talk today and go through some slides. I'll make the slides, they gave me 20 points IQ, that's great. I'm going to make the slides available to anyone, so don't worry too much about whether or not you can see them very well. For me, it's really just trying to illustrate some of the data that we've collected and the findings that we're running into around games. Get started. I'm going to talk today some about some of the knowledge production that goes into massively multiplayer online games. Now, when most people think about massively multiplayer games, they usually think of World of Warcraft, which I'll talk about in a minute. But generally, these are spaces much like the one we're in today. And 5 years ago, they were really considered almost a fringe kind of activity, whereas now it's, for some professions, considered the new golf. So what are these spaces? It's much like Second Life, except they're game spaces. They're spaces like Lineage, World of Warcraft, etc. These are played in virtual worlds, just like the one we're in now, that are real time, meaning that if we want to meet here for a conference, obviously we have to coordinate our time zone differences. They're also perpetually accessible, so that, you know, if I can't sleep at 3 a.m., I can come and do work in a virtual world that's alive and kicking and people are on it. In the terms of games, they're actually typically loosely structured by fantasy narratives of some form, whether that's a Tolkien-esque kind of medieval context, or whether it's something like Star Wars Galaxies, like a franchise topic like Star Wars. But they're primarily known for what some have called escapist fantasy, yet I'll argue for a real kind of social realism in these spaces. By that I mean, in the context of elves and ogres and dancing, fantastical creatures, you have people engage in many of the behaviors you'll see offline. All of the mundanities of offline life end up finding their place in virtual worlds. For example, saving for houses, building content, worrying about your friendships and relationships, and worrying about crime. So as I said, when most people think of a massively multiplayer online game, they think of World of Warcraft, and that's for good reason. World of Warcraft has really pushed this particular form of video game from the fringe to the center stage. World of Warcraft, for those of you who are not familiar with this title, it is the single most successful computer game that's been on the market, and it boasts of about 13 million people globally right now. Now, in those numbers, we'll have to, there's a little bit of a caveat in that a large part of that number comes from China, which people forget about, that there's actually a large Asian population that plays this particular title. In the work that I'll be talking about for today, I'm going to try and stick with just World of Warcraft. As I said, so that's sort of the rundown on massively multiplayer games, but what about knowledge production? See, I study them not because simply people do them. I mean, people do lots of things that I don't find very interesting. What I do find interesting about these spaces is that in the context of play, you have an incredible amount of knowledge production going on. So people are doing work that I'll argue looks and feels a lot like what we want them to be doing in school and what we want them to be capable of in their everyday life that's actually hard to demonstrate in research studies. And yet you go to these play spaces and you find out that they're just rampant with this kind of intellectual work. In my own work, I've really, with the help of MacArthur funding and Spencer funding, I've been able to sort of pursue a handful of empirical threads, more or less, topics that that I found to be most salient in these spaces. My work began in 2005. I did a 2.5-year ethnography of the top MMO games on the market at that time, which were coming out of Korea. So out of Korea came Lineage 1 and Lineage 2, and I did a 2.5-year ethnography of those spaces, just trying to get my head around, what was happening in terms of the cognitive and cultural life of these worlds. At the time, there was no work on them except for from the point of view from design. So I wanted to look at what are the culture of these spaces and what practices are people engaged in. So I did that work, and these were some of the main topics I came up with. And since that time, I've done some more kind of controlled experimental studies of, all right, if these are the practices people are engaged in, what is the extent to which people are engaged in them, what's the quality of those practices, etc. So I want to sort of focus on a couple different topics today, if you don't mind. I'll talk a little bit about some of the findings with scientific habits of mind, and then I'd like to touch on literacy practices, since that's a topic near and dear to my own heart. So let's dive into some studies. So we started looking at scientific habits of mind back during the Bush administration, when much of the funding for science was really kind of contested at that time, and there was a real concern about kind of a growing science illiteracy in the United States. we did is we went back and we took the AAAS standards for scientific habits of mind. Now, if you're not familiar with this document, this is kind of the Bible of science standards. AAAS is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and they wrote out 504 benchmarks of what they felt students should graduate from high school knowing in order to be able to be scientifically literate. Sort of that document then became national standards, which then sort of proliferated down into state standards. So this is sort of the original source document for those standards for science. And what we decided to do was take a look at some of the forum discussions around this commercial game World of Warcraft. Now, why would we do that? Well, back in the ethnography, I ran into some kids that during summer months were actually gathering data off the MMO game they were playing. They were putting it in Excel sheets. They were building small mathematical models about those data, and then they were arguing over whose model was the best model. At that time, one of the boys who was doing this was a key informant in my ethnography, and I was talking to him about this, and I said, you realize what you're doing is actually model building. What you're doing is just a form of science, and it's a fundamental form of science. And at the time, he said, no way, I'm not doing science. What I'm doing is just trying to cheat the game. So I found this very intriguing. So we decided to do a study trying to look at how frequently do people actually engage in this kind of intellectual work. Is this something that only a handful of very enthusiastic players engage in, or how prolific is it? And we decided to go to the discussion boards really because it's data that holds still, so to speak. I mean, it's data that is a little bit more easily culled than in-game data. And it's where you see a lot of this sort of intellectual work in terms of model building going on. So we decided to randomly select one of the discussion forums of World of Warcraft. And at the time, there were 32 different discussion forums. We grabbed one of the discussion forums. We randomly selected about 2,000 posts over 85 threads. And we did that in order to give ourselves a representative sample and also to have a pretty good confidence interval. So our confidence interval is lower than 10%. It's about 9.1 or so, which is to say that we have we have some strong claims that we can make about what people are actually doing and not doing. We built a coding scheme, and this scheme, there's really 3 parts to it. We wanted to look at first, were gamers engaged in forms of argument or scientific discourse around the game? So were they, for example, backing up their claims with evidence? It turns out that in many sort of online public debates, there's the accusation out there that forum debates end up with a pooling of ignorance rather than, say, making claims and then providing evidence or data to back those claims. So we wanted to see, first and foremost, were participants engaged in actual argument versus just sharing opinions? Second part of the scheme was built to see, to look for just the kind of model-based reasoning that I described from the ethnography. So we wanted to know, were people looking at systems in the game, and if they were they building models in order to understand or predict those systems? And were those models mathematic in any way? And then finally, we looked at epistemology, which is kind of an odd topic. But in some pilot work, we had run into stuff that really looked like science. They were debating aspects of the game. They were talking about models. But they were doing so in the pilot work. We had a funny feeling that they were kind of taking a stance toward knowledge that we wouldn't really consider science. So what was happening was that we had gamers in the pilot work that looked to be basically trying to reverse engineer the coding of the game. Now this makes sense, right? I mean, in a virtual world, you know that there is ultimately algorithms that are generating the world behavior. So sometimes in the pilot, when people were talking about models, it almost seemed as though they were trying to argue that there was one algorithm that generated the world and that their model was actually that particular algorithm. Now, the reason that this is a problem is that in actual science, you don't have that luxury. In the real world, there is no algorithm generating natural phenomena. Instead, a model is seen to be a model of phenomena after the fact, and that model can be replaced any day that you run into data that challenges what you built, or when you come up with a better model. So your model is never seen as sort of this ultimate big T truth. Instead, it's seen as theory that describes the phenomena that needs to be manhandled, that can be replaced whenever it no longer is the best suited model to the data. This last part of the scheme was kind of built, and it was included in our analysis because we wanted to make sure that if we were going to call this stuff science that people were doing, we wanted to make sure that we weren't including stuff that was sort of approaching knowledge from a very anti-science place. So simply trying to reverse engineer the code of the game was not what we wanted to call science work. So we included this last part in order to check ourselves to make sure we weren't, kind of making too broad of claims here. Okay, so that's a whole lot about the coding scheme. So let me show you what we came up with. Our first question was kind of the obvious one. We're looking at discussion forums around a commercial game played for fun that's totally voluntary, that people are paying $15 a month to play. So our first question was really, is their discussion productive? And now if you look at this pie chart, hopefully you'll see that, yeah, in fact, it's overwhelmingly productive. On a good day, and I'm pretty optimistic about MMOs. I mean, I sort of am out there championing that, playing games is not just intellectually barren activity. And yet on a good day, I would have said 30% of their discussion would have been problem solving and what we would call social knowledge construction. Instead, what you see is 86% of the data that we ran into, which is a random representative sample, was in fact focused on social knowledge building. Now that's pretty incredible, because essentially what you're arguing then is that 86% of discussion forums are not merely about socialization or mom jokes or simply ranting. In fact, what they're doing is problem solving. 8% was pure social banter, and then you'll notice that another small margin was simply marked as uncodable. Reason for that, I should say now, is that when we coded these data, I have a policy that if we don't know where to put it, we simply mark it as uncodable. So rather than trying to jam data to match our coding scheme, we simply said if we can't tackle it and can't figure it out, then we simply mark it as uncodable. We also did inter-rater reliability, by the way, between 4 coders, and had an inter-rater reliability around 92%, which is to say that our coding system is stable and is worth pursuing. So let me continue. Looked at argumentation and discursive practices, it turned out that, yeah, people were actually engaged in argument. About a little over a third of the time, they were focused on building on one another's ideas, and another third of the time, they were using counter-arguments. Makes sense. So about a third of the time, they were agreeing and elaborating on each other's positions, and about a third of the time, they were disagreeing. One really interesting percentage point there is that, as far as using data and evidence, it's about 28%, which is good. That's a pretty good figure considering what the overall national rates are, which I'll talk about later. But about 28% of the time, people were actually leveraging data to support the claim they were making. So let me go on. If we look at model building, which was the original motivation for the study, what we found was that about 68% of the time, people were in fact looking at systems within the game. That's good. It means that about 68% of the time, the player discussion was focused on trying to understand particular in-game systems. About 41% of the time, about 11% of the time, people were focused on model-based reasoning. So the kind of behavior that I ran into in the ethnography happens about 1 in 10. About 1 in 10 discussion posts was focused on presenting some form of model. Not bad. About half of that time, that model was being evaluated in terms of whether or not it was a good predictor of what actually happened in the game. And that's good. That's a little bit higher level of sophistication. So to be able to talk about a model or a system, trying to understand a system in terms of a model is good. Trying to evaluate your model based on its ability to predict that system is even better. If you look at those very last tiny little columns, you'll see that about 4% of the time people were actually mathematizing their model, which is pretty good. 1% of the time they were even providing computation as a form of proof for the validity of their model. So 1% of the posts actually included full mathematical computations as a way to persuade other people in the discussion. Kind of a small number it looks, but let's take a look at an example post so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about here. Just going to walk through a particular post in the data set so you can get a sense of what is the texture of these kinds of discussions like. Now, in this particular slide, what you're seeing is one post from a gentleman who's interested in a particular in-game system that has to do with shadow priest spells. Now, if you're a World of Warcraft player, this is probably familiar to you. So let me walk through it a bit. So at the very beginning, this gentleman starts off by saying, you know, the unfortunate fact is that there is no shadow nuke, and goes on, blah, 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 blah. So he's talking about whether or not a particular class of character in the game deserves to have this particular spell. There is no spell like this, but the community is debating what this spell would be and what its characteristics would be if they had it. So that's what we tagged as social knowledge construction. In this case specifically, he's building on the community's discussion already ongoing. He's contributing in a collaborative kind of way. He goes on to say, you know, I've put together my own spreadsheet which goes into more detail and takes into account exactly what happens to spells with regard to talents. Now here what's happening is he's talking about the spell system and the talent build system within the game. So those are two systems in the game that interact. And when he says, I've put together my own spreadsheet, he later actually provides a link to his model, which is a big spreadsheet. So when we say model-based reasoning, this is the kind of rhetorical move I'm talking about. He goes on to say, you know, if you think I've got something wrong, email me at, and he gives his email. And then he says, but if you read up at wowwiki.com and check out the coefficients used in the theorycraft mod, you'll find out that I'm consistent, yada, 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 yada. So here what he's doing is referencing outside resources. In fact, showing that he has built on what other community members have already discovered, and he's fact-checking himself against those other documents. So there we tag that as referencing outside resources. That's important if you want to think about the activity, the knowledge building enterprise. Part of that means that you need to build on one another's work. Now finally, toward the end, he goes on to say, if Flay were empowered to the point that it received 65% of plus damage, then Shadow would be up around 45% DPS scaling, etc., etc., etc. Seems confusing? No. If you don't play World of Warcraft, or even if you play World of Warcraft, this is a pretty complicated sentence and claim. Essentially what he's saying is that if you were to change one of the parameters in his model, the prediction would be that Shadow would be up around 45% DPS scaling. So this is what we mean by model testing, or testing a model based on its ability to predict accurately what the system would do. No small feat. So when we say that they are, you know, half of the time they present a model, they're actually evaluating it in terms of its predictability. That's what we mean. So let's take a look at, if you look at that link up that he provides, let's take a look at what this model looks like. That 11% of the time they were focused on actually giving one another models. Half that time they evaluated them in terms of prediction. And then if you'll recall, 4% of the time they were mathematical. So here's what this model looks like. There you go. So when we say that only 1% of the time people are doing a mathematical model and providing the actual computation as a form of argument for their model, that 1% of the time is fairly off the charts in terms of its complexity and sophistication. I'll be very honest with you. I mean, I do have an undergraduate degree in mathematics, and it took me a while to actually work my way through understanding what his model is doing. So the main point I'm trying to make here is that not only is general patterns within these game discussions productive in terms of social knowledge construction, in terms of argument, and even in terms of model building, but even in the smaller percentages, when you see these sort of more sophisticated practices, even at 1%, that 1% is really incredibly salient. Let me move on. Remember, I talked a little bit about tacit epistemologies and arguing that we wanted to make sure that we weren't overextending our definition of science to stuff that looked like science and smelled like science, but actually was a form of knowledge building that we wouldn't consider scientific at all. Here's a pie chart of what we ended up finding. We had 3 different categories. Now, these categories are based on Deanna Kuhn's work, if you know her stuff in argument. I'm a huge fangirl of Deanna Kuhn. So we found there are 3 different divisions. Let me walk through. The first one over on the far right is absolutist. So about 30% of the time, participants were engaged in absolutist talk of the sort of, whose mom believes that blah, blah, blah. So kind of dismissive of other people's contribution. This is the kind of attitude that says there is one truth out there, it has a big capital T, and lo and behold, it's the truth that I have. Not very scientifically focused, but about 30% of the time that was the approach that people demonstrated. A much smaller percentage of the time you saw a relativist sort of stance toward knowledge. Okay, so about 5% of the time, you saw people that took a more nihilistic approach. This is the kind of talk that says, it's all just opinion, the experts don't agree, there's no point to debating it. Now, while a relativist perspective on some things may not be bad, when it comes to knowledge building, if you take that kind of stance toward knowledge, simply debating or discussing the issue becomes pointless, right? If it's all just opinion, then there's no point to trying to build knowledge in the first place. Now let's look over at the evaluative stance. So 65% of the data that were codable showed an evaluative epistemology. Now, this is exactly the kind of epistemology that we were hoping to see. An evaluative epistemology says, I see your point, but I wonder if, meaning that you treat knowledge as something to be evaluated, something that's worth manhandling. And without this kind of approach toward knowledge in place, there is no point to even engaging in a scientific sort of inquiry-based enterprise, right? I mean, if there's no point to actually evaluating claims, then the whole enterprise becomes fruitless. So 65% of the discussion forums showed just the kind of stance toward knowledge we were hoping for. Numbers are pretty good. Now, let's take a look at this compared to Kuhn's original work. In Kuhn's original data, what she found across the general American population, now this is 1991, but in her work, she actually showed that only 15% of the American population even demonstrated a stance toward knowledge that would make science an important or useful endeavor in the first place. Now that's important. If you look at 65% in video game forums versus 15% in the overall population, there's a huge discrepancy there. We have to ask ourselves, where is that discrepancy coming from? Is it that are video games somehow teaching people to take an evaluative stance toward knowledge? Or would you say that people with an evaluative stance toward knowledge are drawn to video games? Truthfully, I don't think we really know yet. I think it's probably, my hypothesis at least would be that it's probably both. It's probably that People who play video games, just like Second Life and other virtual worlds, in fact, other fan media, people who play video games and tend to be interested in this level of knowledge work are probably drawn to the discussion forums, right? So people who are interested in talking about models or problem solving of the ilk of puzzling through the systems are going to go to the discussion boards and debate them. So probably what you're seeing is that people who already have an evaluative stance are drawn to those spaces. On the other hand, there is a sense in which the community of the discussion forums in these play spaces very much inculcate one another with worldviews that suggest that this kind of view toward knowledge is high social capital. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. In video games, let me put it very bluntly. For the generation that doesn't play video games, they see them as kind of sort of a dead waste of time. You know, you hear these and you read different editorials in places like the New York Times, across books and magazine, and various scary kind of claims out there that claim that video games are sort of rotting people's minds. They're antisocial. They've been called intrepid. They've been called that they inculcate people with immediate gratification, thereby sort of eliminating their ability to engage in more sophisticated forms of delayed gratification like books, right? Well, that's the whole kind of claims that you hear out there. And yet, what you find is that in video game culture, being smart is actually cool. So there's high social capital to being able to puzzle through a particular game system. It's not only that you can button mash, but that in fact, if you come up with a new clever way of doing something, it's actually tied to social capital. And that social capital is really important, not just for young adults, but for grown adults as well. So my point being is that my own claim would be that you're seeing both that people with an evaluative stance are drawn to discussions around games, but also that game culture kind of thinks that being smart is sexy. Let me go on. Here's what's even more compelling. If you look at that compared to some of the data we've seen as far as scientific literacy across America, they're finding that about 1 in 5 Americans is what they would consider scientifically literate. What that means is that you're basically able, for example, to read the New York Times science issue on Tuesday and make sense of it. And so only 1 in 5 Americans is considered scientifically literate. And that's despite mandatory instruction in science in classrooms. Now that's pretty shocking. If you think about, everyone has to take science in high school, and yet only 1 in 5 Americans can actually read the New York Times science section with any level of understanding. So it's a problem. And you have to ask yourself what's happening in classrooms when we're only able to get 1 in 5 Americans scientifically literate, yet we're forcing everyone to take science. Well, part of that answer actually lies in some of the inquiry activities that we build in classrooms. What they're finding is that, so for example, there was a national report that went out around chemistry labs. Now, for those of us who have been science teachers in the past, your lab activities are where you really think that you're getting kids involved in actual science. Ask any good science teacher and they'll say, yeah, the textbook is okay, but really the kids are learning about science when they're able to get their hands dirty, get into chemistry labs, get into their biology labs, and actually do the practices of science. Well, they did a big national assessment of those activities, and it turns out not only are those activities not teaching kids science, they're actually engendering in kids very anti-science views, just of the sort that I just discussed. So here's what kind of happens. You have kids in a chemistry lab who, while the teacher believes that she's engaging them in this sort of authentic inquiry that's just like science hypothesis testing, what happens is that the kids, in fact, are engaged in a very different kind of practice. What the kids are doing is much more along the lines of, oh, there is one answer, and it's the one that the teacher has. And the idea of the science lab is that you redo your lab work and redo your experiments until you get that one right answer. the one that the teacher has. Now, if you recall what I was saying about sort of an epistemological stance, that's much more of an absolutist stance, which is not what we would consider scientific. So in fact, what you have is that due to a variety of reasons, which I won't touch on here, but you have inquiry labs in school that in fact are engendering antithetical, anti-science views toward knowledge, where in game environments, you're actually seeing very much scientific sort of stances toward knowledge. Ironic, isn't it, given that games are usually firewalled out of classrooms? I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, and you'll have to forgive me for doing a big chalk and talk at you, but I'll just keep going, and hopefully we might be able to take questions or something at the end. I want to say a little bit about literacy, simply because this is really where much of my work started out, and I have a weak spot in my heart for literacy practices. So back in the ethnographic work, I took a look at what is the truth of some of the claims around, that games are replacing books and that kids aren't reading and writing. At that time, this is some work out of 2007, actually demonstrated that in fact there is this rich array of literacy practices that are part and parcel of what it means to play these spaces. So the upshot of this argument is that even if you take a very traditional view of literacy, it turns out that reading and writing is very much a fundamental part of games. So the argument that somehow kids are no longer going to read just doesn't make any sense, because they are reading. It's just that they are reading around their own hobbies and topics. After that, we wanted to find out, okay, so we know that there are all these texts involved with playing something like an MMO, but what is the nature and the quality of those particular texts? That's important, because we can't just say that kids are involved with texts. We need to be able to say something about what kinds of texts those happen to be. So we did, what we decided to do was we started off by interviewing 46 players. They were evenly split. Half of them were experts, half of them were novices. And we had them list to exhaustion all of the various resources that they used while playing World of Warcraft. So we had an N of 46. And then what we did is we took a random sample from those resources to do a closer analysis in terms of vocabulary and reading level. So let's take a look at what we found. What kind of text do WoW players use when they play? Well, if you take a look at this pie graph, what you'll see is that there's essentially 5 primary types of documents that kids and adults use when playing games. 46% is information resources. Now, for those of you who are literacy geeks like me, this should be a number that makes you raise your eyebrows. It turns out that expository kind of informational text is also one of the harder texts for young adults and adults to comprehend. So it's interesting that a more difficult form of text is actually the primary type of text used when it comes to games. There's also some variety here. So about 23% is group organization tools. That means text people use in order to coordinate their collaborative work. You've got about 10% is discussion forums, just like the sort that I just discussed. So when we say that that gamers are doing scientific reasoning in their discussion forums, that scientific reasoning is, in terms of the text around games, is about 10% of that makeup of the constellation of texts around games. Another 14% is UI mods. So these are pieces of software that users download and upload, debug, etc. I won't touch on those today. And then another 7% is actually what I would call fandom media. So this is more your artistic and humanities side of the text around the game. So things like fandom movies, short stories, artwork, etc. So interesting profile as far as the constellation of text goes. Let's take a closer look at that huge swath of information resources. Okay, so we decided to take a sample of 50 randomly selected pages for closer analysis. And what we found based on some of the statistical analyses was that, in fact, the reading level of these texts tend to be around 12th grade. So whereas a newspaper is written at 8th grade level, most of the text around games is ranging around 12th grade, so much higher reading level than you might anticipate than even, say, a newspaper. We do a lexical analytic study of these texts. What that means is that looking at what kind of words and vocabulary are used in the texts, what you find is that about 70% are something we call K1 words. All that is the 1,000, K1,000 words. K1 words are the 1,000 most frequently used words in the English language. So that's kind of your base vocabulary. So about 70% is just base vocabulary, nothing interesting there. But if you go down and take a look at, for example, you might hypothesize that these texts are mostly filled of jargon, game-specific jargon. It turns out that's not quite true. Only 4% of the texts are actually vocabulary specific only to the game. But I put a big asterisk next to the percentage that you should most pay attention to, and that's that AWL words list. What we're finding is that across this random sample, about 20% of the vocabulary used in these texts around games is actually considered on the academic word list. And the academic word list is, for literacy geeks, this is the list of words that appear in, for example, academic textbooks, regardless of domain. So this is a list of words that would, in fact, help you improve things like your ACT scores, your GRE scores, etc. These are, they're typically heavy Latinates, etc. But they're academic language regardless of what domain you're going into. And it turns out, by the way, that test performance on many of those college entrance exams is actually tightly correlated with vocabulary size in terms of these academic words. So these academic words are important. And what we're finding is that even in the context of games, a full 20% of the vocabulary used on these sites is actually academic language. If you're familiar with James Paul G. and his work on literacy in video games, he actually predicted this. What his prediction was that many of these games are a bridge into academic forms of language, and that bridge is really important. So these are texts that include words like, words like pagination, estimation, prediction, words that will help you actually perform better and comprehend better on academic texts. So that's a pretty good figure. Question was, okay, so that tells us something about what the profile of these texts are like, but how do we know anything about reading and reading comprehension of those texts? So how well do players do on them? Another study. In this particular study, we actually wanted to look at struggling readers. For 2 years, I ran an after-school program based on the game World of Warcraft, and really it was targeting boys that were disaffiliated and failing in school, but loved a game. And we wanted to see, how can we use their love of games as a way to ameliorate some of the problems they were having in school. But for time's sake, I'm just going to focus on the study that we did on reading. So we decided to do a study where we would measure their reading ability and then choose text that was either school-based or games-based and looked at how well they could perform on them. Here's one thing we found. When we looked at their reading level versus text based on games or text based on literally coming straight out of their social studies textbook, their performance was absolutely the same. So there was no statistically significant differences in terms of their ability to read game text versus school text when we controlled level of difficulty. We asked ourselves, what happens if they get to choose the game text that they're asked to read. One thing, remember, I just told you that for these game texts, they're averaging around 12th grade. Well, in this study, many of our participants were reading at, say, the 6th or 8th grade level, when in fact they were in high school. So they were reading at a much lower level than their own grade. But this time we decided to ask, well, what happens if we just let them choose the text they want to read and let it be as difficult as it naturally would be? Here's what we found. In fact, when they were allowed to choose the topic of the text, they actually were performing 7 to 8 grade levels above their own head. Now, this is significant. This is to say that when they cared about the topic, they were performing at college graduate level, when in fact in school they were reading 5 to 6 levels below their grade. The question is why? Why would this be the case? Seeing here is, if you look at, you may not be able to see it, but when we unpack the data, what we found was that part of it could be chalked up to their ability to deal with challenge. So when they were reading text that they cared about, their self-correction rates skyrocketed. And self-correction, so when you're reading a text and you run into a word you don't understand, or a piece of language that troubles you, if you don't care about what you're reading, you're willing to let that misunderstanding go and just keep moving on, right? Well, what was happening was that when they cared about the text they were reading, they were actually sitting there worrying through the challenge that they were on, and actually forcing themselves to come to some understanding before moving on. And when you do something like a reading exam, or estimating someone's reading level, the self-correction rate does not count as errors. They count as absolutely fine. All of us run into challenges when we read something, no matter what level of education you have. What matters is, are you willing to puzzle through it and make sense of it before going on? What you're finding here is this. These young men that we studied in this particular study, what we found was that they're actually able to perform at much higher levels when they care about the topic than when they don't. Now, why does this matter? This matters because what I'm actually trying to argue here is that, we have a long history in education of confounding culture in something like IQ. So many times we mistake cultural differences for differences in ability. And it's been a really kind of sad story if you look at the history of something like IQ tests. Well, reading comprehension is a very valence topic. Reading comprehension is considered on par with IQ. And yet what we're finding is that part of what people have taken as ability is in fact about interest. It's not that these boys cannot read difficult text, it's that they don't want to read difficult text when it's on topics they just don't care about. I'm out of time here. I'm gonna take one more minute and just go very quickly through this very last part, simply because it's an important topic that gets more toward the social side, which is crucially important when you're talking about virtual worlds. And that's the topic of pop cosmopolitanism. Of my earlier work, and part of what I'm trying to argue today, is that in fact you have these virtual spaces. We used to fantasize about what Oldenburg calls the third place. These are pubs, bistros, etc., where people get to hang out and informally socialize in a place that's neither work nor home, but a third place that allows us to build our informal social networks. Well, it turns out that we no longer have spaces like the community bar. Instead, what we have are these virtual spaces. Kids are using these as places to hang out. Now, that hanging out actually matters. In fact, what they're building is bridging social capital. There are two types of social capital: bonding, which is your your close social relationships, but those also tend to be very homogeneous in terms of the demographics of the people making up your close network. Bridging social capital is important and often overlooked. Bridging social capital is not your close relationships of social support in times of trouble, but instead it's actually that broad social network, and it turns out that that broad social network connects you up with much greater diversity. So, whereas your bonding social capital, people look like you, they sometimes are genetically related to you, they tend to hold the same beliefs politically and otherwise that you do, bridging social capital is where you run into diverse views, you run into diverse backgrounds. And it turns out that in these virtual worlds, people are not only doing these intellectual sort of knowledge production practices, but in fact what they're doing is building up their bridging social capital. They are engaged with diverse groups of people in ways that you don't see in other points online. In my work, I've argued that this is a form of what we'll call pop cosmopolitanism, that in fact what people are beginning to build in these spaces is the ability to navigate social networks with incredible diversity across those networks. Know that video games as a technology is what they call a push technology. So as video games enter the home, soon behind them comes many forms of other sort of technology. If you've ever had to buy a new computer in order to play the latest game, you know what I'm talking about. So video games push hardware into the home. But part of what I'm arguing today is that it's not just hardware that they're also pushing social norms and practices. And those social norms and practices include things like pop cosmopolitanism, include things like scientific sort of habits of mind, and forms of literacy that are valuable for spaces beyond just virtual worlds. End with just one of my favorite quotes from Will Wright. And this is a quote where he says, kind of sums up what I'm trying to get at. And he says, the gamer's mindset, the fact that they are learning in a totally new way, means that they'll treat the world as a place for creation and not simply consumption. And that this is the true impact of video games will have on our culture. If there's one point I want to make today is that video games and virtual worlds like the one we're in right now, these are spaces that are beginning to breed a new ethos where the everyday Joe is one who creates content and not merely consumes it. And that is the enduring sort of impact that video games and virtual worlds will have in our lifetime. All in there, and if you're interested in these topics, I have a flyer up right now about the conference that we run this summer, and you'll find more information about that conference at glsconference.org, or just send me a text message. And thank you.
And thank you, Constance. That was fascinating. We have a few questions. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but we do have a few, and if it's all right, I'll just jump right into them. The first one was all the research with boys. Do you have any insights on how girls are behaving? Are there any differences that are gender-based?
Absolutely, there are differences that are gender-based. I'm really glad someone asked that. I tend to focus on boys because my interest is literacy, and boys are traditionally struggling with literacy, whereas girls are not. So my own work, I know much more about the situation with boys. If you're interested in topics around girls and games, I would highly recommend Elizabeth King's work, one of my senior doctoral students, and also Elizabeth Hayes, who's at the Arizona State University, does some amazing work on Tech Savvy Girls program.
All right, good stuff. Lisa Lane asks, have you seen anyone showing direct improvement on a standard like the SAT or something similar?
No, I actually don't look at that in my own work. I tend to look more at how do these practices transfer, or how do they pay off in their everyday lives. I mean, one thing that people, I guess just sort of as my own position, I really feel like we've fetishized classrooms to the point where now people are expected to take anything they learn and transfer it into a classroom, where originally classrooms were designed to teach people things that would transfer out to the real world. So in my own work, I tend to look at how do these things pay off in their lives beyond classrooms. So for example, are the kids in our after-school program, are they reading more in their everyday lives? Are they engaged in forms of problem solving that look like science outside of school? And it turns out overwhelmingly that's true. Now I can say that of my sample, but that's only 23 boys I've looked at for 2 years. So we're still in the process of sort of teasing out what that means and what it means for different demographics.
Right. Well, that leads me into my own question, which was gets exactly at that. I'm so with you on that point about classrooms. What's your biggest insight on what people are taking out from these spaces and applying into the rest of their life?
Wow, that's a hard question. If I were to be brutally honest, I would say that probably the single most important thing that people are getting out of it actually doesn't have anything to do with the kind of practices I look at empirically. It actually has to do with identity. And I'll be honest with you, it's humbling because I've done 7 years of ethnographic and empirical work now on games, and yet I'm trained to look at cognitive practices. My expertise is looking at what are the cognitive, social, and individual practices people engage in, what is their nature, what's their quality, and how do they use them in their lives. And that's great, but if you really want to know the truth, I would have to say that probably the most important thing that's happening in these spaces has nothing to do with this sort of structuralist cognitive approach, but actually has to do with their sense of identity. And by that I mean, let me borrow from a slasher film that Jodie Foster was in. There's this great scene where she gets in an argument and someone says something about how she's dwelling on a past activity, and they say, well, that doesn't matter. And she turns to this person and says, it makes all the difference. That changed me, and so it changed everything. And by that I mean that people are having significant experiences in game spaces that are allowing them to sort of formulate new identities of who they are. And that transformation of identity is probably the single most powerful form of learning that I have run into and that we've seen. Now, I think there are probably people whose background can lend themselves to understand identity much better than my own can. My training and background in education tends to take a really impoverished view of what we mean by identity. Usually we sort of conceptualize it as nothing more than sort of a mental representation of who you are. But it's a really complex and deep topic. And I think if I were to be very honest, I'd have to say that it's probably the identity work that people are doing that matters the single most in learning.
That's been my own experience of 5 years of working in virtual worlds as well. I think you're right on with that. We have one last question, but we only have about 30 seconds for you to answer it. Jana is asking if you know of a game like World of Warcraft that might be less violent and more appealing to girls.
Yeah, I would first recommend Yville. It's not like World of Warcraft, but Yasmin Kafai and her team have found some really interesting stuff on Yville, and that has been one of the MMOs that really does appeal to girls in a way that others don't. Right now I'm looking at RuneScape, but you see the same things. It's really about killing, which doesn't appeal to everyone. I also know that Rebecca Black has been doing some really interesting work on some of the younger MMOs. So games like Club Penguin, games like Farmville. Farmville has been quite the rage right now on Facebook as far as Facebook games go.
All right. Well, I tell you what, thank you, Constance, for a fantastic session, and more than that, for the work that you're doing to document, what's really going on in these spaces. It's really such a tremendous contribution to the field, and we're so appreciative that you were able to be with us today. For those who don't know, Constance is a relatively new mom, and so she made time to be with us, and we're very much appreciative. So if everybody could give her a big round of applause, and thank you very much, Constance.
It's a real honor to be here. This is one of the most important events that we've seen come up on Virtual World, so I consider it a real honor to be here. And thanks everyone for coming and sitting through my slides. If you need any more information, just contact me. It's constance@gmail.com. Thanks so much.
Okay. Well, we've run a little bit late, but we have Amy Gordon over at the Coliseum, which is our other venue, who is ready to get started in just about 3 minutes. She's going to be talking about using new media in museums to build lifelong learners. Amy's from the College of William and Mary, and so I encourage you to make your way on over to that. And those of you who still have questions for Constance, maybe you might, work with Constance in chat on those. And again, Constance, thank you very, very much for being with us today. We really appreciate it.